So I'd like to have a look at this diagram now and talk about what it is that drawing is responsible for exactly. Craig Mullins, in one of his courses, said that drawing is everything in an image except for color and value. Now, if you think of the amount of information that actually gives you, it would mean obviously that it's the entire space, which would be the basis of the illusion of creating an image for someone to look at. It would also be the ability to position all the things that are within your scene, all the characters, all the actors, all the different things that they are doing, the actions that they're performing, and all the different props, all the different accessories, all the things that are populating that space, the entire world that you create, that your image is essentially a window into. When you remove value, which means tone, when you remove that, and then color as well, since they are both essentially facets of light. So what he's saying there is that if you remove light from an image, everything that's left over, drawing is responsible for. So if we have form, and by form I mean essentially this. When you're looking at an image, whether it's a photograph or when you're just looking at the world really, what you get to see is you get to see forms, volumes that are illuminated by a light source. This would be the underlying volume, right? We have the head that we looked at before, and it's defined by all of these different lines. We pretty much have the entire structure of it. This is a three-dimensional volume. When we apply light to it, it turns into this. Now it's essentially form. Everything that we look at in the world is just a form that we can see. So I would like you to think of form as this. This is kind of like the logo for form. So it's geometry or volume or underlying structure, if you prefer. Those are all interchangeable. So it just means that it's more than just outline that we're concerned with. It's more than just shape. It's more than just this flat contour. And I keep hammering this because a lot of beginners are just trying to get that. A lot of tutorials also for beginners would be something like how to draw an eye. And let's say it'll just be, well, make a oval shape, make a corner, make whatever. So it's just, essentially, it's just trying to create this shape. And this will get you the shape of an eye, but this really isn't understanding the eye, because what happens as soon as you turn it around? So let's say if we wanted to do a head that's from the side, if we do that, and if we have our same eye shape, so if I put my eye, if I make the same shape for the eye now, it doesn't look right. And it's because this is obviously an eye from the front. So what you learned from that tutorial isn't essentially how to draw the eye, it's how to draw the shape of an eye from the front view. But what if it turned around? So this is when, again, volumes and form come into place, because in order to understand the eye, you essentially need to know that it is a sphere and then the lid wraps over it. So now if we were to redraw the same thing but with volumetric understanding, we have a sphere and this is a sphere. So this will be having three-dimensional space. This is actually taking up space. It's not just a circle. So if we have that and it's facing towards us, and then we're going to have the lid. Now the lid is something that is, it's a bunch of skin and it's coming over. There's actually this tarsal plate, it's called, underneath here. So there's actually form, there's space, there's thickness to the lid. So if we have that, and then there's thickness to the bottom lid. So if we have it come out, and again, it needs to come out because the sphere of the eye is pushing against it. And then we'll have the bottom lid over here. And then when we insert the cornea, when we have that, and it'll probably be overlapped by those lids, now we have more of an understanding of what an eye is. And if we had to rotate it, let's say we have a sphere again, and then we have the lid again coming out. So let's go a little bit higher over here. So we have the lid coming out, wrapping around the sphere here, and the thickness. So we need to have the thickness. We need to factor perspective into this, and we need to have the thickness of this lid. So look at just how much volume it's taking now. It isn't just lines anymore. Again, it's a volume. And here's the bottom lid. It's coming out. And here's the thickness of this bottom lid. And I'm using these cross contours. I'm essentially, with them, I'm suggesting what the underlying surface is. And now when we put in the cornea as well, and it's also going to be bulging out, when we have that, now we actually have a three-dimensional eye. We have the side view of the eye now, or more of a three-quarter. So we have the underlying geometry or volume, and it can be defined by lines, and the contour is only the consequence of this volume. So basically, the space that this head takes up, what beginners are obsessed with, getting these outside shapes, these shapes are just a consequence of the structure of the object. So we're actually looking to understand and build these objects rather than to just have these outlines. Because with an outline and with a shape, we can't reuse it, right? Unless you memorize every single configuration of the eye and what it's going to look like when it's in different perspectives and different angles. So unless you memorize each and every shape, it doesn't serve you to be memorizing shapes. It's far too many variables. And if you had 1,000 possible eye shapes that you had to learn, what happens when you combine that with the rest of the head or the entire body, or when you add environments and all the rest of those things. It's just an inefficient way. It's impossible to work that way and to be able to produce things from imagination. So we have the structure on one side, this underlying geometry. When we apply light to it, we end up seeing this. This is normally our final image. When we look at drawings, this is what we get to see. If they are realistic, so if we look at this, we're essentially seeing the application of light onto geometry, onto a volume, onto a complex compound volume. Same thing here. Each and every image that is realistic, from painting to photograph to drawing, it doesn't really matter. What we see as we go into the world, geometry with applied light onto it. And what we're doing here is we're detangling those. We're decoupling the geometry from the light, so that we're able as beginners to isolate all of these different skills and to train them so that we can recombine them afterwards and not constantly get sabotaged by too many different things that are happening and compounding the difficulty of what it is that we're trying to do. So here we have a photograph, and it's a lot harder to see the shapes clearly here, and it's because there's a softer light source, but also normally in reality things aren't as clear cut as they are in a drawing. An artist often edits and stylizes and designs things so that they suit their expression better. They make things to be more dramatic, more engaging, more whatever fits your story. But I hope that we can agree on the fact that what we're seeing here, and right now we're looking at it in color, if I remove that, hopefully you can recognize that this is now the finished form. So from our little form logo, we're actually getting to see this. This is the final result. But underneath it, obviously, is the same structure. So if you look at this head, and in order to analyze it, we need to have some amount of information as to the structure of the head and knowledge of perspective. But if we focus now, instead of the form, instead of the final that we can see, if we focus on what's underneath it, then we can see the same things that we've been seeing over and over. Here's the structure. Here's the actual things that are underneath it. So there's a plane that's going inwards here. This is a round volume. This is a rounded, almost like a tube that's happening here on both sides of the eyebrow ridge. Now over here, the nasal bones, and you can tell from the way that these shapes look, you can tell that there's actually a bit of bone that's irregular, meaning that this is going out a little bit. So it's not a perfectly regular shape. So this is going out, this is a little bit straighter. So the overall shape is something like this. But not only that, obviously, but this is a volume. And this highlight is following very much the structure. Now over here we'll have a sphere. So this will be a sphere now, not just a circle. This is now a sphere. And over here, these nostrils are going inward. So if we had to measure, let's say if we go from here, from this point, and over here to the nostril, this nostril is going inwards. And you can feel when we have these points, this is in front of us, this is in the back. So this is going behind. This image isn't flat, even though we can choose to interpret it as flat. So if we just wanted to copy this, if we just wanted to make an exact one-to-one replica, we could just look at these shapes. Let's remove all this drawing. So we could just look at, let's say, the hair shape, and we could look at the negative space over here from the hair to the side of the canvas, and we could look at the same here, and we could position where things are. And if we wanted to, we could even use the grid. If we wanted to, we could have a very mechanically precise drawing. But this would be looking at things two-dimensionally. I'm wanting here to look at the cause and effect relationship and focus on the cause, not just the final outcome. Now over here, the neck, you can actually see how much space it's taking, how it's fitting into over here would be where the clavicle would be coming out, and over here is the trapezius. So all of these things, all of these volumes, they're always there, and everything that you see relies upon the same structures. The ears obviously on the very side of the head, so if we draw another point over here going inward, so the ear is way over here, whereas the nose is pretty far forward. So you can almost, like, if we encompass this drawing, almost if we put this head in a kind of a container here, everything will have its three-dimensional order in space. Things will be coming forward, they'll be receding, and even though the shapes are kind of hard to see here, they're absolutely underneath the surface. The precision that's required, the structure of the head, everything is absolutely there. Now, here's an image that if you look at it, you might think, well, this is all about the outline. You know, I don't see where the structure is, I don't see how this is a volume, it's just, it doesn't really have anything on it that would indicate that. It's just the outline primarily and a few more lines. So this is all entirely expressed in line. So how is this the same thing? How was this constructed? And if you look at the image right next to it, you can see that a lot of times how things get started, you can see how scribbly this is. So hopefully you get to see it on your screen. You can see that there was actually an underlay over here. So before the drawing progressed to this stage, it was actually messier and things were being constructed. The artist, in this case, it's Dave Raposa, and he was essentially looking for this image. He was constructing it. He was first building the head, trying to establish the structure of it. So trying to put the eyes in the correct place, making sure that the anatomy, the zygomatic arch, the brow ridges here, making sure that they fit together as they should, that the structure of the head is correct. So he constructed this with drawing three-dimensionally. And then once it was done, you start the second pass. You start now clarifying things or eliminating detail, and it's not necessary that this would be the final. In fact, it probably went through many more stages. Here's a version of it further along, and you can actually see that some of the details that were here, they're eliminated. He's decided against those, and this drawing looks cleaner. And if you just look at it here, let's say, you might just think that everything was made in just outline, just from zero to finished drawing. And that's not necessarily true. These heads were very likely done in the same way. They were first drawn scribbly and just looking, trying to find and construct the correct orientation, trying to get things in the right place, relating to each other, getting proportions correctly, anatomy, etc. Looking for the character, looking for the expression, finding the image. Then once that was done, then there were probably multiple more stages to just clean it up, get it to be exactly as you want it to be, to have it be finished. Kind of like a building. The scaffolding isn't part of the finished building, but you absolutely need it as you're building it. So you will have to make up the scaffolding. You'll have to go through all of these different versions and iterations and overlays and redrawings until finally you can take down the scaffolding. You can erase a lot of the lines that are not necessary and only be left with the clean final result. And if you look at these drawings, they look pretty similar as well. Look at this head, for instance, of this girl, and just look at how clean the lines are. Look at how neat everything is. Look at how perfectly everything fits. But if you look at it from up close, you can actually see evidence of construction. So I'm pretty sure that these were measuring lines to just get the orientation of the features in the same alignment, and also to measure, to make sure that the underlying forms are correct, to make sure that the anatomy, that the skull is correctly proportioned. And this line over here is essentially, this is the zygomatic arch. So this line may not necessarily make it into the final drawing. So if we just erase it here, you won't really lose much. But it was absolutely necessary when the artist was drawing it in order for them to be able to judge correctly where things will go, and then afterwards they can edit out all the things that are not necessary. In this case, let's say for instance with this guy, you would probably keep this line because you would want a masculine male to feel like they have all of these different anatomical features that are happening there, that they're chiseled, that they have all of this bone, you know, it's what makes them tough, all this squareness. And then with the female, you would probably want a softer, cleaner look. It would serve better to eliminate most of these. But as you're building it, it's absolutely necessary that you know where the underlying structure is, the skull. You're essentially, Glenn Vilppu, when he's drawing heads, he's essentially drawing the skull. And he'd be narrating what anatomical feature he's drawing, and then over top he covers it up with whatever the external feature is. But he's always drawing the skull when he's drawing a head. It's a fascinating thing to watch if you haven't seen him draw before. So final recap here, what we're trying to do is we're trying to isolate the individual components that make up an image. We're doing that so we can study them in isolation, so that we can focus on a particular task, on a particular aspect, and train that up. Make sure to understand what it's responsible for, and then combine it with all the other peripheral things. So if we were focused on drawing, but we keep getting sabotaged by light, meaning that we're trying to draw, but at the same time, we don't really have a good grasp of where drawing ends and light begins, and we're trying to do, let's say, everything in tone, where before we even do that, we can't place shapes correctly, we can't draw things correctly in the right place, in the right proportion. If we're then compounding that with light also, which then means that we need to have good value recognition, we need to be able to look at a tone, at a step from black to white, and recognize what value that is. How close is it to light or dark? And we need to be able to reproduce that as well. If we're struggling to just make the shapes, and we're also trying to use values, and when you use values, edges also begin to play more of a factor, because we're no longer using line, which is essentially a uniform edge. We now have all these different patches of gray which have edges in between them. Now we have those that can get too mushy, or they can get too hard. We're compounding the problem by making things more and more complicated. We're taking on far too much when we need to focus on just very small, tiny little tasks that may seem trivial. But the thing is that when you're doing an image, there's hundreds of these tasks. And the more of those that you get right, the better your image is. The more of those that you mess up or you misunderstand, the worse your image gets. It's compound interest going in a good direction or in a bad direction. So a drawing is essentially this. It's just the underlying structure. And then this is the finished form. This is when a drawing is coupled with light. This is what we get to see when we look at the world, when we look at a painting. This is what you'll essentially be seeing. Really, 80 or 90% of the work is in the drawing, because just look at how similar this is to what's happening here. Essentially, the drawing hasn't changed at all. It's just that there was the addition now of the light and dark shapes, which give you the illusion of light. So 80 or 90%, the most difficult parts, first, like, what is it that you draw? What is it that you even draw? What's going to be the design of your image? What's going to be your composition? What if you're making up something, how are you going to make it interesting? This is all in the realm of drawing. And at first, you're concerned with drawing just in terms of technical aspects and getting the geometry, getting the structure, getting all these things that we've spent so much time talking about. And once you get those correct, then you don't need to think about them. It's all about what is it that you're doing? What's the idea? What makes it interesting? Why should it be done in the first place? With drawing, you get to think through all of those. You get to sketch things out. You get to try different options. You get to move things around, see if they work any better, get different viewpoints, try out different designs. 80 or 90% of your image is essentially determined by the thinking that you do through and with drawing.